Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing and suppressed chapters of American history. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now and what time it is as you listen to this story. Are you alone in your room at midnight, driving through empty roads? Tell me in the comments below. Your location and time might matter more than you think as we descend into this particular darkness. My name is on this channel dedicated to unearthing the stories that history tried to bury. Today, we examine events from 1856 in the heart of South Carolina during the final years before the Civil War would tear the nation apart. This is the story of Ezekiel, a man whose name appears in only 3 historical documents, and the Ashford plantation, a place that no longer exists on any modern map. What you are about to hear involves accusations so severe, so transgressive, that even mentioning them in the decades following these events could result in violence. This is not a story about ghosts or supernatural entities. This is something far more terrifying because it involves the absolute extremes of what human beings can do to one another and what they can become when pushed beyond all breaking points. In the spring of 1856, the Ashford plantation was a prosperous estate spanning over 3,000 acres of South Carolina lowland. The family had accumulated wealth through rice cultivation, a crop that demanded brutal labor in swamp-like conditions. James Ashford, the plantation owner, was 52 years old and known throughout the county for his particularly cruel treatment of the people he enslaved. His wife, Catherine, was 45, a woman who maintained the facade of Southern gentility while turning a blind eye to her husband's atrocities. Their 3 adult children, Thomas, Margaret, and William, all participated in running the estate. Ezekiel was 34 years old in 1856. Records show he had been at Ashford Plantation since he was 14. Purchased specifically because of skills he had learned in cooking. For 20 years, he served in the main house, preparing elaborate meals for the Ashford family and their frequent guests. Visitors to the plantation consistently praised the quality of the food, noting in letters and diary entries that they had never tasted meat so tender, so perfectly seasoned, so unforgettably rich. But in March of 1856, something changed. The first indication that something was deeply wrong came not from the plantation itself, but from neighboring estates. 3 families who had dined at the Ashford home began experiencing severe illness. The symptoms were described in medical records of the time: violent digestive distress, psychological disturbances, and in 2 cases, complete mental breakdown requiring institutionalization. Then, the disappearances began. Between March and August of 1856, 7 people vanished from the surrounding area. Not enslaved people, which tragically would have gone largely uninvestigated, but white landowners and their family members. The local sheriff's reports, preserved in the South Carolina State Archives, document increasing panic. Posses were formed. Dogs were brought in. The swamps were searched. No bodies were ever found. But something else was discovered. Something that would not be fully understood until decades later, when a renovation of the old Ashford property would unearth secrets that should have remained buried forever. What Ezekiel did, or what he was accused of doing, represents one of those moments in history where the line between victim and perpetrator becomes so blurred that we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and humanity itself. The evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, and in many cases deliberately destroyed. But what remains is enough to suggest that in the kitchens of Ashford Plantation, something unspeakable was taking place. This is not a simple story of good versus evil. This is a story about what happens when human beings are treated as property, when cruelty becomes normalized, and when the oppressed find ways to reclaim power through the most transgressive acts imaginable. What you are about to hear will disturb you. It should disturb you, because if it does not, then we have lost something essential in our ability to recognize horror when we see it. The story of Ezekiel and the Ashford plantation remained whispered about in South Carolina for generations. Never written down, never officially investigated, always existing in that shadowy space between folklore and suppressed history. Until 1923, when renovations forced the past back into the light. And even then, what was discovered was quickly covered up again, deemed too dangerous, too inflammatory for public knowledge. But the truth has a way of surfacing. And tonight, we piece together what really happened in those kitchens, in those dining rooms, during those elaborate suppers that the Ashford family and their friends enjoyed so thoroughly, never knowing what they were truly consuming. To understand what happened at Ashford Plantation, we must first understand the world in which these events unfolded. South Carolina in 1856 was a powder keg. The state had the highest proportion of enslaved people in the nation, in some counties outnumbering white residents by margins of 10-1. The entire economic and social structure depended on maintaining this system through violence, intimidation, and dehumanization so complete that enslaved people were legally classified as property, not persons. The rice plantations of the South Carolina Lowcountry were particularly brutal. Unlike cotton cultivation, rice farming required workers to stand in water for hours, leading to disease, exhaustion, and death at rates higher than almost any other form of agricultural labor in the Americas. Malaria, dysentery, and yellow fever were constant threats. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person working rice fields was estimated at just 36 years. James Ashford had inherited the plantation from his father in 1831. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man of volatile temperament. A letter from 1854, written by a neighboring planter named Robert Middleton and preserved in the Middleton family papers at the South Carolina Historical Society, contains this passage. James Ashford's methods are excessive even by our standards. I have witnessed punishments at his estate that I cannot bring myself to describe in writing. His overseer, a man named Talbot, seems to take pleasure in cruelty that serves no disciplinary purpose. I fear they are creating conditions that will one day result in violence. This letter is significant because it shows that even within a system built on violence, Ashford's plantation was considered extreme. The overseer mentioned, Cyrus Talbot, appears in several other documents. A newspaper article from the Charleston Mercury in 1855 reports that Talbot was investigated for the death of an enslaved man named Samuel, but no charges were filed. The article notes that Samuel's body bore marks suggesting he had been subjected to torture. Ezekiel enters the historical record in 1836 when he was 14 years old. A bill of sale discovered in 2003 by researchers at the University of South Carolina shows that James Ashford purchased Ezekiel from a estate sale in Charleston for the unusually high price of $800. The reason for this premium is noted in the document: skilled in cookery and kitchen management, trained in Charleston household. For the next 20 years, Ezekiel worked in the main house. Unlike field workers, house servants often had slightly better conditions, more food, and less brutal physical labor. But they also lived under constant surveillance, their every action observed by the enslaving family. They witnessed the family's private moments, their conversations, their weaknesses. They served food, handled their belongings, and existed in an uncomfortable intimacy with their oppressors. Several letters and diary entries from guests at Ashford Plantation mention Ezekiel by name. A diary entry from 1851, written by a woman named Elizabeth Grimball, states, "The Ashfords keep an excellent table. Their cook, a Negro named Ezekiel, prepared a roast that was the finest I have ever tasted. Mrs. Ashford says he has a gift for selecting and preparing meat, though she does not tell him this, fearing it would make him proud. Another entry from 1854, written by Thomas Middleton. Dined at the Ashfords. The pork was exceptional, though I could not identify the specific cut. Ezekiel, their cook, apparently has his own methods of butchering that he learned from his mother, who was herself a cook. The meat was so tender it nearly dissolved on the tongue. These accounts are chilling in retrospect. They document something that guests found remarkable, but could not quite identify. The texture, the flavor, the unusual tenderness of the meat served at Ashford plantation dinners. The plantation itself was isolated, situated along the Ashley River, in a region of dense cypress swamps and meandering waterways. The main house was a typical low-country mansion, 2 stories, white columns, surrounded by live oaks draped with Spanish moss. Behind the main house were the kitchen buildings, separated from the residence because of fire risk. Further back were the quarters where enslaved people lived, and beyond that, the rice fields that generated the family's wealth. In the kitchen building, Ezekiel had dominion. He supervised 2 younger workers, both women, who assisted with food preparation. He had access to the smokehouse, the root cellar, and the butchering shed. He made weekly trips to Charleston, accompanied by an overseer, to purchase supplies that could not be produced on the plantation. He had more freedom of movement than most enslaved people, and more knowledge of the surrounding area. Catherine Ashford kept detailed household accounts. These ledgers, preserved in fragmentary form, show regular purchases of pork, beef, and game. But they also show gaps, periods where meat purchases decreased significantly, yet the family continued to host elaborate dinners. During these periods, the accounts note only meat provided from estate resources. What were these estate resources? The plantation raised hogs and chickens, but not cattle. Hunting was common, but game meat, venison, wild boar, turkey has a distinctive taste that would have been recognized by guests. Yet the meat served during these periods was consistently described as similar to pork, but somehow richer, more complex in flavor. The social world of South Carolina planters in 1856 was highly interconnected. Families visited each other frequently, creating networks of obligation and social debt. The Ashfords hosted dinners for the Middletons, the Grimballs, the Ravenels, and other prominent families. These dinners were displays of wealth and status, with elaborate courses served on fine china, with crystal glassware and silver utensils imported from England. At these dinners, Ezekiel would appear briefly to present dishes, then retreat to the kitchen. Guests would compliment the food, never speaking directly to the cook, as social convention prohibited direct interaction between enslaving whites and enslaved people in such settings. Ezekiel remained a background figure noticed only for his culinary skills, otherwise invisible in the social choreography of Southern plantation life. But invisibility can be a weapon. When people do not truly see you, when you are treated as an object rather than a person with thoughts and agency, they do not consider what you might be thinking, planning, or doing beyond their immediate instructions. They do not imagine that the person preparing their food might have reasons to wish them harm. They do not consider that access to the kitchen, to the butchering shed, to the smokehouse might provide opportunities for acts of revenge so profound that even contemplating them seems impossible. In February 1856, 1 month before the first mysterious illnesses would strike neighboring families, an enslaved woman named Ruth died at Ashford plantation. The cause of death was listed as fever. She was buried in the plantation cemetery, a segregated area beyond the rice fields. Her death was not considered unusual. Death was common, but Ruth's grave would later become significant in ways that no one in 1856 could have imagined. The first documented indication that something was wrong came on March 18, 1856. The Middleton family, who had dined at Ashford plantation 3 days earlier, reported to their physician that all 5 family members were experiencing severe digestive illness. The doctor's notes, preserved in medical archives, describe symptoms that puzzled him: violent nausea, psychological agitation, and what he termed moral distress of an unusual nature. Robert Middleton, the family patriarch, apparently told his doctor something that the physician found so disturbing, he noted it in Latin rather than English. Pater dixit se comedisse carnem humanam insomnio, et post hoc omnia mutata sunt. Translated, the father said he dreamed he had eaten human flesh, and after this, everything changed. The doctor attributed this to fever-induced delirium. But 3 days later, Elizabeth Grimball, who had also attended the same dinner at the Ashfords, wrote in her diary, "I cannot rid myself of the most horrid thoughts since dining at the Ashfords. The meat, which I praised at the time, now haunts my memory. I dreamed last night that I was consuming something forbidden, and I woke screaming. Thomas thinks I have taken ill, but this is not illness. This is something else, a knowing that I cannot name." Within 2 weeks, 3 families who had recently dined at Ashford plantation reported similar experiences. The local doctor, Nathan Pierce, began to suspect food contamination. He visited the Ashford estate on April 2nd to inspect the kitchen. His report, discovered in 2007 in a private collection, states, "I examined the kitchen facilities and found them clean and well-maintained. The cook, a Negro named Ezekiel, answered my questions with appropriate deference. I could find no evidence of spoiled meat or contaminated ingredients. Yet I must note that the cook's demeanor, while outwardly respectful, conveyed something I can only describe as hidden amusement, as though he knew something I did not." Dr. Pierce recommended that the Ashfords cease hosting dinners until the source of the illness could be determined. James Ashford reportedly became enraged at the suggestion, viewing it as an insult to his household. The dinners continued. Then came the disappearances. On April 15, 1856, a man named Henry Ravenel left his home to inspect timber on his property and never returned. Search parties found his horse, still saddled, standing near a creek. His rifle was discovered leaning against a tree, but there was no sign of Henry Ravenel himself. The sheriff's report noted, "No evidence of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away from the scene. It is as though he simply vanished from the earth." 6 days later, a young woman named Caroline Grimball disappeared while walking from her family's plantation to visit a neighbor. Her bonnet was found on the road, nothing else. By early May, panic was spreading through the county. 5 people had now vanished without trace. The local newspaper, the Beaufort Gazette, published anxious articles speculating about wild animals, accidents in the swamps, or possibly enslaved people rising up in violence. The third possibility caused particular terror among the white population, and several plantations increased their patrols and punishments as a preventive measure. But there was no evidence of organized resistance, no signs of violence, just absence, empty spaces where people had been. On May 23rd, something strange was discovered. A field worker at the neighboring Middleton plantation found a cache of belongings hidden in the hollow of a large oak tree near the property boundary with Ashford Estate. The items included a pocket watch belonging to Henry Ravenel, a cameo brooch that Caroline Grimball had been wearing when she disappeared, and a silver flask engraved with the initials of another missing person. The sheriff organized a thorough search of the area. They found more hidden items, all belonging to the disappeared, scattered in various locations around the borders of Ashford property. But again, no bodies, no blood, no indication of what had happened. On June 2nd, the sheriff questioned everyone at Ashford plantation, including the enslaved population. According to his report, he spoke with Ezekiel for approximately 20 minutes. The report states, "The cook claims to know nothing of the disappearances. He says he is always in the kitchen or the main house and has no opportunity to witness events in the surrounding countryside." When asked about the meat served at recent dinners, he provided receipts and documentation for all purchases. When asked if he had noticed anything unusual about any guests who had dined at the plantation, he said only that some guests had seemed troubled in spirit. But he attributed this to the general anxiety in the community about the disappearances. The sheriff noted something else. "I observed that several of the enslaved people present seemed frightened, but not of me or my deputies. They seemed frightened of each other, or perhaps of something they knew but could not speak of. One woman, when I asked if she knew anything about the missing people, looked toward the kitchen building and then looked away quickly, as though she had almost revealed something but thought better of it." Who was this woman? We don't know. Her name was not recorded. In the brutal economy of that time and place, enslaved people's testimony was not considered legally valid, so their names often went undocumented unless they were accused of crimes. The disappearances continued through June and July. In total, 7 people vanished between April and August of 1856. All were white landowners or their family members. All were people who had, at some point in the previous 6 months, dined at Ashford plantation. Tell me in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe these events are connected? Is there something darker occurring than simple disappearances? What do you think was really being served at those dinners? By August, the community was in a state of near hysteria. Armed patrols rode constantly through the countryside. Some families left the area entirely, abandoning their plantations. The economic and social structure of the county was beginning to collapse under the weight of fear. And then abruptly, everything stopped. After August 14th, 1856, there were no more disappearances, no more mysterious illnesses. Life, slowly and uneasily, began to return to something resembling normalcy. The Ashford family ceased hosting dinners, claiming that the atmosphere of suspicion made social gatherings impossible. James Ashford himself seemed to have aged dramatically, according to a letter written by a Charleston merchant who visited in September. Mr. Ashford appears haggard and nervous. He has lost considerable weight. His wife moves through the house like a ghost. The children are silent. The whole estate feels cursed. But if the terror had ended, the mystery had not. Because in that autumn of 1856, workers repairing a drainage ditch near the plantation cemetery made a discovery that would raise questions no one wanted to answer. The grave of Ruth, the woman who had died in February, had been disturbed. The coffin was empty, the body was gone, and it was not the only grave that had been opened. Over the next weeks, as workers investigated, they found that 6 graves in the plantation cemetery had been emptied, all recent burials, all within the previous year. The bodies had been removed carefully, the graves then restored to hide the disturbance. Only the drainage work had accidentally revealed what had been done. The discovery of the emptied graves forced an investigation that the local authorities had been reluctant to pursue. Sheriff William Drayton, who had investigated the disappearances with limited success, now faced evidence of something that seemed impossible to explain through conventional means. His expanded report, dated October 3, 1856, marks a turning point in the documented history of these events. Drayton ordered a complete inventory of all graves in the plantation cemetery. What he found was systematic desecration. 9 graves, all of enslaved people who had died within the previous 14 months, had been opened and emptied. The work had been done carefully, professionally almost. The coffins, simple pine boxes, had been removed intact, then returned to the graves after the bodies were taken. Earth had been replaced and smoothed. In most cases, the graves looked entirely undisturbed from the surface. But why? And who had done this? Drayton's investigation focused on the possibility of grave robbers selling bodies to medical schools. This was a known problem in the 1850s. Medical education required cadavers, and the bodies of enslaved people and poor whites were frequently stolen for this purpose. Charleston had a medical college that was known to purchase bodies without asking too many questions about their origin. But there were problems with this theory. First, the bodies would have been in various states of decomposition, making them less valuable for medical study. Second, there was no evidence of anyone transporting bodies off the plantation. Third, and most importantly, the timing was wrong. Graves had been opened at different times, seemingly as needed, not all at once, as would be expected if someone were harvesting bodies for sale. Drayton questioned everyone at the plantation again. This time, he separated people and questioned them individually, away from their enslavers. This was highly unusual for the time and reflected the seriousness of what he was investigating. His notes from these interviews survived, though they are fragmentary and some pages are missing. From an interview with a field worker named Moses, dated October 8th, I asked the subject if he knew anything about the disturbed graves. He appeared terrified and said nothing for several minutes. Finally, he said, "Nobody touches the dead. That's wrong. That's the worst wrong." I asked if he knew who had done it. He said, "The one who cooks knows things. The one who cooks does things in the night. But we don't speak of it. Speaking brings death." From an interview with a woman named Sarah, who worked in the main house, dated October 10th, the subject initially refused to speak at all. When I assured her that she would not be punished for telling the truth, she said, "The meat comes from somewhere. When there's no pigs killed, when there's no trip to Charleston, but still there's meat in the smokehouse, the meat comes from somewhere." I asked what she meant. She said, "I am not permitted to say more. If I say more, I will be the next one in the ground, or not in the ground, whichever is worse." These cryptic statements meant little to Drayton at the time, but they suggest that some people at the plantation suspected something terrible, yet were too afraid to speak directly. Fear of punishment from James Ashford certainly played a role. But there seems to have been another fear as well, a fear of Ezekiel himself or of what he represented. On October 15th, Drayton ordered the smokehouse and kitchen at Ashford Plantation to be thoroughly searched. What he found was documented in an inventory list. Standard items, barrels of salt, hanging hams, dried herbs, cooking implements. But there was something unusual. In a locked storage room within the smokehouse, accessible only by a key that Ezekiel carried, Drayton found a collection of butchering tools that seemed excessive for plantation use. Specialized knives, bone saws, and other implements more suited to a commercial butcher than a plantation cook. He also found a ledger written in Ezekiel's handwriting that documented cuts of meat, curing times, and recipes. The entries were meticulous, but many of them used terms that Drayton did not recognize. References to specific cuts that did not correspond to pork, beef, or game. Notes about preparations that seemed designed to disguise the origin of the meat, to transform its texture and flavor. On October 22, 1856, something happened that would remain officially unrecorded, but would surface in private letters and diaries for decades afterward. Sheriff Drayton, under pressure from prominent community members to resolve the crisis, arrested Ezekiel on suspicion of grave robbery and possibly murder. This arrest was not documented in official records, suggesting that what followed was considered too dangerous to preserve in public archives. What we know comes from private sources. A letter written in 1889 by Drayton's daughter, Martha, contains this account. My father, in the last years of his life, spoke of matters he had kept secret for decades. He told me that in October of 1856, he arrested the cook from Ashford plantation, believing him responsible for terrible crimes. He held him in a locked room at the courthouse and questioned him for 2 days. What the cook told him, my father said, was so monstrous that he did not know if it was true or the ravings of a madman. The cook claimed that everything he had done was justice, that the meat he had served was righteous vengeance, that those who treated human beings as animals should be made to consume human flesh without knowing it. My father said the cook showed no remorse, only a cold satisfaction. He said the cook told him they praised my cooking. They said it was the best they ever tasted, and it was because I had seasoned it with their own crimes. If this account is accurate, then Ezekiel confessed to serving human flesh to the Ashford family and their guests. But which human flesh? The missing people who had disappeared? The bodies taken from the cemetery? Both? According to Martha Drayton's letter, her father faced an impossible situation. If he charged Ezekiel with murder based on this confession, a trial would make the allegations public. The idea that prominent white families had unknowingly consumed human flesh prepared by an enslaved person would cause social upheaval beyond anything the county could manage. It would call into question every aspect of the plantation system, would make enslavers terrified of the people they held in bondage, would suggest that the enslaved population had power in ways that could not be controlled. Moreover, there were no bodies. Without physical evidence, proving murder would be difficult. And some of the meat had allegedly come from people already dead, taken from the cemetery. Was it murder to dig up and butcher the already deceased? The law had no clear answer, especially when the deceased were enslaved people whose bodies were technically property. The letter continues. My father released the cook after 3 days. He had no choice, but he warned James Ashford that the man was dangerous and should be removed from the kitchen. He said Ashford laughed at him. Ashford said, "He's the best cook in South Carolina. I'm not giving that up because of your suspicions." 2 weeks later, my father said, the cook vanished from the plantation. Whether he escaped, was sold away, or met some other fate, my father never learned. But he believed that Ashford, after thinking about what had been alleged, had the cook killed quietly and buried somewhere on the estate. My father said he should have investigated further, but he was afraid of what he might find, afraid of having to acknowledge truths that would destroy the social order. This suppressed testimony, if accurate, suggests that the authorities knew or strongly suspected what had happened, but chose to bury the truth rather than confront its implications. The alternative, making public that enslaved people could strike back in such profound ways, was unthinkable. In November 1856, James Ashford became seriously ill. His personal physician, Dr. Nathan Pierce, documented symptoms that included severe digestive distress, hallucinations, and what the doctor termed a fixed delusion that he had committed unwitting cannibalism. The doctor attributed this to mental breakdown brought on by stress and the troubles on the estate. But Catherine Ashford had her own suspicions. According to a diary entry written by her sister who visited in December 1856, Catherine had searched the kitchen and smokehouse herself. In her sister's words, Catherine found a notebook hidden beneath the floorboards of the smokehouse. She would not show it to me, but said it contained recipes written in Ezekiel's hand, alongside notes that suggested the recipes were not for animal meat at all. She said one recipe specified that the meat should be soaked in buttermilk for 3 days to remove any unusual flavor, then seasoned heavily with herbs to disguise its origin. Another described how to render fat and strain it to achieve a texture similar to pork lard. Catherine burned the notebook immediately, terrified that anyone else might see it. If such a notebook existed, its destruction eliminated crucial evidence. But other physical evidence may have remained on the plantation, hidden in places that would not be discovered for decades. The winter of 1856 to 1857 was difficult at Ashford Plantation. James Ashford's health continued to decline. The enslaved population, sensing instability, became increasingly restive. Small acts of resistance multiplied, tools breaking, crops failing, livestock wandering off. The plantation's productivity dropped significantly. In February 1857, exactly 1 year after Ruth's death had initiated the chain of events, another enslaved person died at Ashford Plantation. A man named Isaac, who had worked in the kitchen alongside Ezekiel. The cause of death was officially listed as accident. He had allegedly fallen and struck his head, but there were rumors that Isaac had been killed deliberately, possibly because he knew too much about what had transpired in that kitchen. By spring of 1857, Ezekiel was no longer at Ashford Plantation. Plantation records, fragmentary as they are, show no sale, no transfer, no documentation of his fate. He simply disappears from history. Some accounts suggest he was killed by James Ashford. Others suggest he escaped, possibly to the north. A few whispered stories recorded much later claim he remained in South Carolina, moving from place to place, occasionally working as a cook under different names, always carrying with him the knowledge of what he had done. The most intriguing of these later accounts comes from a journal entry written in 1871 by a Union Army officer stationed in South Carolina during Reconstruction. The officer wrote, "I met an elderly colored man who claimed to have worked on a plantation before the war. He said he had been a cook and had learned to prepare meat in ways that white folks praised highly, though they never knew what they were truly eating. He said he had served them their own evil, dressed up and seasoned, and they had thanked him for it. I thought he was speaking metaphorically about his resentment toward his former enslavers. But his eyes, when he told me this, held something cold and satisfied that made me wonder if he meant it literally. Could this have been Ezekiel?" The officer did not record the man's name or where he encountered him. It remains one of many tantalizing fragments that suggest Ezekiel may have survived the events of 1856 and lived on, carrying his terrible secret. The Ashford family never recovered from the events of 1856. James Ashford died in 1859 at age 55, his death attributed to stroke but perhaps hastened by psychological torment. His will, filed in Beaufort County, made unusual provisions. A portion of the estate was to be sold, and the proceeds used to establish a fund for the care and maintenance of the plantation cemetery in perpetuity, so that the dead might rest undisturbed. This phrase is significant. It suggests that Ashford, in his final years, was consumed by guilt or fear related to the disturbed graves, and possibly to what had been done with those bodies. His insistence on protecting the cemetery suggests an attempt at expiation, a desperate hope that ensuring the future dead remained at rest might somehow atone. For the past, Catherine Ashford lived until 1873, but became increasingly reclusive. Letters from relatives describe her as haunted and obsessed with past sins. She reportedly refused to eat meat for the final 15 years of her life, taking only vegetables and bread. When asked why, she would say only, "I cannot trust what is placed before me." The 3 Ashford children dispersed after their father's death. Thomas moved to Charleston and worked in shipping, dying childless in 1882. Margaret married, but her husband reportedly left her after she suffered a mental breakdown in 1864, during which she raved about consumption of forbidden things. William moved to Georgia and attempted to establish a new plantation, but his venture failed. He died in poverty in 1891. The plantation itself declined rapidly. During the Civil War, Union forces occupied the area, and Ashford plantation was partially burned. The enslaved population was freed, and most left immediately, wanting nothing more to do with the place. Local people believed the plantation was cursed, and no one wanted to purchase it, even at deeply reduced prices. For decades, the main house stood empty, slowly deteriorating. The kitchen building collapsed in a storm in 1879. The fields returned to swamp and forest. The plantation cemetery became overgrown, the wooden grave markers rotting away. By 1900, almost no trace remained of what had been one of the most prosperous estates in the county. The land was considered worthless, too associated with tragedy and horror to be developed. It passed through several owners who did nothing with it, holding it only as a speculative investment that never materialized. And there it might have ended, the whole terrible story fading into vague legend, dismissed as exaggeration and rumor, if not for what happened in 1923. 67 years after the events we have been describing, the past would force itself back into the present in a way that could not be ignored or explained away. In the spring of 1923, a Charleston developer named Harrison Webb purchased the former Ashford property with plans to clear the land for timber harvesting. The main house, though in ruins, still had structural elements that Webb believed could be salvaged. He hired a crew of local workers to begin dismantling the building systematically, preserving anything of value. On April 12, 1923, foreman Samuel Jackson made a discovery that would reignite interest in the long-dormant mystery of Ashford Plantation. While examining the foundation of the old smokehouse, Jackson's crew found a sealed chamber beneath the floorboards, a space approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, accessible only through a trapdoor that had been concealed under wooden planking. Jackson's report to the Charleston police, preserved in the case files, describes what they found. "We discovered an underground room, brick-lined and sealed. Inside were human remains, skeletal and partial, arranged on wooden shelves. My count indicated parts from at least 8 to 10 individuals, though I'm not expert enough to say for certain. Also present were various tools, knives and saws, and a leather-bound book that appeared to be a journal or record of some kind. The discovery made headlines throughout South Carolina. The Charleston News and Courier ran the story under the headline, 'Grim Discovery at Abandoned Plantation. Chamber of Bones Found Beneath Old Estate.' The article sparked immediate speculation about what had happened at Ashford Plantation decades earlier. The skeletal remains were examined by Dr. Howard Bennett, a physician with some experience in anatomy. His report, dated April 20th, 1923, concluded that the bones were human, that they showed evidence of deliberate butchering with sharp implements, and that they had been stored in the chamber for many decades, possibly since the 1850s. Dr. Bennett noted, "The cuts on the bones are consistent with the dismemberment of animal carcasses for consumption. The precision of the cuts suggests someone with considerable skill in butchering." But it was the journal that provided the most disturbing evidence. The leather-bound book, approximately 8 inches by 10 inches, contained entries in careful handwriting. The first page bore only a name: Ezekiel. This record, 1856. What followed were dated entries describing preparations, recipes, and philosophical reflections. The journal was written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be coded language, possibly to hide its true contents from anyone who might discover it. However, enough was clear to establish the general nature of what had been recorded. An entry from March 1856. They eat what I give them and praise it. The Middletons were here tonight, 5 mouths consuming what was once Ruth. She died of their neglect, of their refusal to provide medicine that might have saved her. Now she is inside them, becoming part of them. Is this not justice? They made her into meat by treating her as property. I have only made literal what they made metaphorical. An entry from May 1856. The disappeared ones are not disappeared. They are transformed. Henry Ravenel, who whipped my cousin to death in 1852, is now cured and hanging in the smokehouse. When I serve him next week at the dinner for the Grimballs, will they taste his cruelty? Will it season the meat with bitterness? Or will their own cruelty recognize its kindred flavor? An entry from June 1856. I have become a monster to fight monsters. I know this. But my monstrosity is clear and honest, while theirs hides behind civilization and law. They call me boy and treat me as a beast. I have shown them what beasts truly do. I have made them into cannibals without their knowledge. Every bite they took was communion with their own evil. The journal was immediately seized by authorities and declared evidence in a criminal investigation, though of course no one could be prosecuted for crimes allegedly committed 70 years earlier by someone who was almost certainly dead. The journal was locked away in the Charleston police archives, and access was restricted. Officials feared that making its contents public would cause racial tensions at a time when South Carolina was already dealing with significant social upheaval. However, portions of the journal were leaked to the press, and the story became a sensation. For weeks, newspapers across the South ran articles debating whether the journal was genuine or an elaborate hoax. Some claimed it must be a forgery, that the story was too terrible to be true. Others argued that it fit with whispered legends about Ashford plantation that had circulated for decades. A professor of history at the College of Charleston, Dr. Marcus Sutton, investigated the journal's authenticity. His report, published in a limited circulation academic journal in 1924, concluded that the handwriting, paper and ink were consistent with the 1850s period. The historical details mentioned in the journal, when cross-referenced with other documents from that era, were accurate. Dr. Sutton's conclusion: while I cannot prove beyond doubt that this journal is authentic, I find no evidence of forgery. The document appears to be a genuine artifact from the 1850s, written by someone with detailed knowledge of Ashford plantation and the events of 1856. The discovery sparked renewed research into the disappearances of 1856. Genealogists and historians attempted to track down descendants of the missing people. What they found was suggestive. Of the 7 people who disappeared in 1856, only 2 were ever mentioned again in any documents. The other 5 simply vanished from the historical record entirely, as though their families wanted to forget they had ever existed. One descendant, a woman named Margaret Ravenel Stanton, great-granddaughter of the disappeared Henry Ravenel, gave an interview to the Charleston Post in 1925. She said, "My family never spoke of Henry's disappearance. When I was a child and asked about him, I was told only that he had gone away and that we did not mention his name. My grandmother, his daughter, would become visibly distressed if his name came up. Once, when I pressed her, she said, 'Your grandfather met a fate he earned, and we bear the shame of it.' I never understood what she meant until these recent discoveries." This suggests that some families may have suspected or even known the truth, or at least part of it, and chose to remain silent out of shame or horror. In 1967, another piece of evidence surfaced. A woman named Sarah Clemens, who was 93 years old and had been born enslaved on a plantation neighboring Ashford, gave an oral history interview to researchers from the University of South Carolina. In that interview, recorded on audio tape and preserved in the university archives, she spoke about stories she had heard as a child. My grandmother told me about Ashford plantation. She said there was a cook there who did something terrible, but also something that the enslaved people understood. She said he took revenge in a way that the white folks could never recover from, because once they knew what he'd done, they could never unknow it. They would always wonder, always doubt, always feel sick when they remembered those dinners. My grandmother said the cook disappeared one night, just walked away, and nobody ever saw him again. Some said he went north. Some said he went into the swamps and lived wild. Some said Mr. Ashford killed him, but my grandmother believed he got away clean and lived free somewhere, carrying the satisfaction of what he'd done. Sarah Clemens was asked directly, "Did your grandmother tell you what the cook had done?" She replied, "She did, but I won't say it on this recording. Some truths are too heavy to speak out loud. Some truths, once spoken, can't be taken back. You have access to records. You can figure it out yourself, but I won't be the one to say the words. This testimony is significant because it represents oral history preserved within the African American community, a counter-narrative to official records that often excluded or distorted the experiences of enslaved people. It suggests that what happened at Ashford Plantation was known, discussed, and interpreted differently by different communities. In the decades following 1967, a few other fragments emerged. A photograph discovered in a Charleston attic in 1982, showing a group of people at what appears to be Ashford Plantation in the early 1850s. In the background, barely visible, is a figure that might be Ezekiel, standing near the kitchen building. The photograph provides the only potential visual evidence of his existence. A letter found in 1995, written in 1873 by a former enslaved woman to her daughter, mentioning the cook who served justice cold and seasoned. The letter does not elaborate, but the timing and context strongly suggest a reference to Ezekiel. Most recently, in 2019, ground-penetrating radar was used to survey the former Ashford property, now a nature preserve. The survey detected anomalies consistent with unmarked graves in several locations beyond the documented cemetery. Excavation has not been authorized, so what these anomalies represent remains unknown. But they raise the possibility that there are more secrets buried in that soil, more evidence of what transpired during those terrible months in 1856. We have reached the end of what can be documented, the edge of what historical evidence can tell us. Beyond this point, there are only theories, interpretations, and the uncomfortable questions that this story forces us to confront. What really happened at Ashford Plantation in 1856? Let us consider three possibilities, each supported by some evidence, none definitively proven. The first theory: Ezekiel did exactly what the journal claims. He systematically butchered bodies, both from the cemetery and from people he killed or had killed, and served this flesh to the Ashford family and their guests over a period of months. This theory is supported by the journal, the hidden chamber of bones, the testimony of witnesses who hinted at terrible knowledge, and the pattern of disappearances. It explains the mysterious illnesses, the psychological disturbances reported by guests, and the emptied graves. If this theory is true, then Ezekiel committed one of the most elaborate acts of revenge in American history, transforming his enslavers into unwitting cannibals as punishment for their treatment of enslaved people as less than human. The second theory: the journal is genuine, but exaggerates or fantasizes about acts that were planned but not fully executed. Perhaps Ezekiel did desecrate graves and did kill some of the missing people, hiding their bodies and possessions to create fear and chaos. Perhaps he wrote the journal as a fantasy of revenge, imagining serving human flesh even if he did not actually do so. This theory allows for the physical evidence while questioning whether the most transgressive acts were real or imagined. It suggests that Ezekiel's revenge was psychological, making his enslavers believe they had committed cannibalism, even if they had not. The third theory, the entire story is a constructed myth, a legend that grew from fragments of truth but was never historically accurate. Perhaps there were disappearances, grave robberies, and unexplained deaths at Ashford plantation, as there were at many plantations during that violent and unstable era. Perhaps the journal found in 1923 was a forgery, created by someone who wanted to tell a story about enslaved resistance, or by someone who wanted to profit from sensationalism. Perhaps Ezekiel was simply a cook who worked at Ashford plantation and disappeared from records as millions of enslaved people did. His real story lost, while a fictional one grew in its place. Which theory is correct? We cannot know with certainty. The evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, and in some cases deliberately destroyed. The people who knew the truth, if anyone truly did, are long dead. The land where these events allegedly occurred has been reclaimed by nature, its secrets buried beneath decades of growth. But perhaps the uncertainty is itself significant. Perhaps the power of this story lies not in definitive proof, but in what it forces us to acknowledge about the system of slavery, about the violence it inflicted, and about the ways that violence can return upon those who perpetrate it. Slavery reduced human beings to property, to meat, to bodies that could be bought, sold, worked to death, and disposed of without consequence. If Ezekiel did what the journal claims, he made that metaphor literal in the most horrifying way possible. He showed his enslavers what it truly meant to treat people as consumable objects. He made them into cannibals, violating one of humanity's deepest taboos, in order to punish them for violating the deeper taboo of enslaving other human beings. This is not a comfortable story. It does not offer easy moral lessons or clear heroes. If Ezekiel did these things, he committed acts that we would classify as serial murder and desecration of human remains. Yet he did so in a context where he and everyone he knew were legally classified as property, where violence against them was routine and legal, where they had no recourse to justice through any legitimate means. Can revenge ever be justified? Can extreme violence in response to extreme oppression be understood, even if not condoned? These are questions that extend far beyond this particular story, touching on fundamental issues of justice, resistance, and the moral ambiguity that arises in systems of absolute power. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened at Ashford plantation in 1856. The bones found in 1923 were quietly reburied. The journal remains, locked in archives, accessible only to researchers with specific permissions. The land itself keeps its secrets, and perhaps that is how it will remain. What we are left with is a story that refuses easy interpretation, that demands we sit with discomfort, that asks us to consider perspectives that are troubling from every angle. And perhaps that discomfort is exactly what we should feel when confronting this chapter of American history. If this story has affected you, if it has made you think about questions of justice and revenge, power and resistance, I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you believe really happened? How do we make sense of violence committed by the oppressed against their oppressors? These are not abstract questions. They resonate through American history up to the present day. Before you go, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode from our haunted community. We explore the darkest corners of history, the stories that challenge us, disturb us, and refuse to release us from their grip. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of America's most suppressed and troubling historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that history is not always what we wish it to be. Sometimes it is exactly what we fear it might be.